Okay, welcome folks to the second Baraza of the spring 21 semester. It's a real great pleasure to welcome Joel Hartter back. Joel did his PhD here in the Department of Geography. And I won't go into all his numerous publications that he's churned out since then, but I know that he's worked a lot with current and former UF faculty members, as well as some current and former UF graduate students, part of a big network that spans a lot of different institutions in a lot of different countries. For those of you that have participated in any of our working groups over the last 15 years, you all owe Joel and a couple of his comrades at the time a debt because it was really them that came to the center at that time and said, hey, we've got an idea. We want to do more things with natural resource management. And that turned into the first working group at the center, which was the NRM group, which continues to this day. And that's really what allowed us to get other funding to fund all the other various working groups that we have at the center since then. So Joel, welcome back. You should be able to share your screen now. So I'll leave it to you. Thanks.
Thanks for having me. I am excited to be back. This is an absolute thrill for me. I'll share my screen here in just a quick second here. Yeah, thanks everybody for being here. I can't wait to tell you a little bit more about what the work that I've been doing here. So I'm just going to go ahead and share a screen. So bear with me here for a quick second. All right, so you should be able to see my screen. Todd, can I just get a confirmation that you can see that?
Not yet, Joel.
Not yet. Okay.
There you go.
Does that work?
Yep, you're good.
Perfect. All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm just absolutely thrilled to be back. I wish I could be there in person. Gainesville is a place that is near and dear to my heart, and I really do sincerely miss the place. It has been a while since I've been back, and I'm just enormously happy and humbled to be here. So, and thank you to the Center for African Studies for the call and invitation to be here, and for Todd and for the center. It goes without saying that they have been a tremendous support for not only for my career, but also for a lot of the ideas. And I also want to especially recognize really the building blocks of where I am here, the staff, the students, FLAS fellows that I was involved with, and others, faculty, and under the directorship of Dr. Leah Villalon when I was there a number of years ago. So for those of you who may not know me, I graduated in 2007 from the Department of Geography. I was here from 2004 to 2007, was a FLAS fellow for 3 years and earned a PhD in geography, as Todd said, under the direction of Drs. Abe Goldman, who's recently retired from and was director of the Center for African Studies, as well as Jane Southworth, who's now department head over in Department of Geography. So today I want to talk to you about the work that I started when I was at UF and continue to this day. I also want to recognize and thank the team who really has been in full support, but really contributed substantially to this work that I'll present. So you may recognize a couple of names here. Karen Bailey, who was my postdoc, was a PhD student and very involved in Center for African Studies, is now my colleague in environmental studies at University of Colorado. And Nick Dohaniak, who is a PhD candidate currently in geography. So just to start off, this is no surprise, but this is putting into context of where we are today. And I'm going to put some numbers up here. you know, the world's population certainly is growing, and this is part of the discussion that I have every day, and really part of the discussion that Abe Goldman and I would have often over beers is about what is happening with the world population, where Africa's population far, in the growth of it, far outweighs other places in terms of growth. The forecasted growth between what was, you know, the early part of the decade and into 2050, really we're looking at large growth that really dwarfs any of the other continents. And to characterize sub-Saharan Africa in particular, where I'll focus, and then begin to focus more and more into places where I work in East Africa. About half the people live on less than $1 a day. Most people are rural. They're living outside of cities. And there are 435,000 deaths completely preventable due to malaria. Fertility rate continues to be high, 1,000 different languages. And what's really interesting here is that the continued and rapid growth of SIM connections, so the rapid growth of mobile phone use, to show too is how Africa is rapidly changing. But it's really this population growth that I want to key in on today. And as we think about population growth, and where my work really is centered is that combination or that intersection between population growth and conservation. Okay, so about half of Africa's terrestrial ecoregions have been lost by habitat cultivation and expanding urbanization areas. But what we know too is that many of the protected species, the 25 most endangered primates, of the 5 are in Africa and 11 if you count Madagascar. And where I'm going to focus today is on beginning to zoom further into it. And again, it's that intersection between that growth, that population growth, and conservation. So where I became interested is around places that are biodiversity hotspots. Hotspots are important in informing the flow of conservation resources, but don't provide any guidance about how conservation should be carried out on the ground. Simply, it's looking at this, looking at places that might be threatened because of increasing population growth, increasing urban places, as well as declines in resource pools. But when we look at some of the places that of those biodiversity hotspots around the world, the Eastern Afro-Montane, okay, which is highlighted here on the map, is the largest forest region of the biodiversity hotspots. It has the largest land area of any of Conservation International's biodiversity hotspots. It's ranked number 4. According to total hotspot area affected by socioeconomic conditions. In other words, it's one of the hottest hotspots, most biologically important area, most affected by poverty issues. Within that is where I work, in the Albertine Rift. And that is, oops, there you can see that circle there. That's what we're going to talk today. Is if we zoom even further into of the hottest hotspots, this place, one of the most threatened, about 313 square kilometers, has a variety of different vertebrate species, more endemic vertebrate species than anywhere else in Africa. And in Uganda specifically, 21 mammals, 12 birds, 54 fish, and so on the endangered list by IUCN. It's an extremely important place for biodiversity habitat. But let's zoom in here. When we talk about the hottest hotspots, and when I started working in Uganda, the population was about 28 million. Okay, Uganda is about the size of the U.S. state of Oregon. Right now, where it was when I started working there in about 2005, 28 million. Now we're at 45 million people. Most people are farmers, but here is the big part of the conversation too. It's that rapid population growth, where it's at over 3.5% population growth annually. Fertility rate continues to be quite high, And in fact, when I started working there, the population density was about 120. And every year I've had to update my statistics. And here, most recently, we're almost at 230 people per square kilometer. It's a place where there's a densely settled place. Most of the land is used for farming. So what we see in this hottest hotspot that is extremely important for conservation is also this rapid rise in population. So in addition, what's important too, because this area is full of, it's important for conservation, right? Is that we have the national parks are one of the main mechanisms for conservation. And across East Africa, parks are important. They're important economic engine. They're important for tourism, for job growth, for bringing particularly international visitors. Here you can see in Tanzania, in Kenya, in Uganda, it's quite a different story, right? But still, it's a large part of their GDP, almost 8% of the GDP. And pre-COVID, well over 200,000 visitors. Now, again, the history, because of the political instability and what I say is the sort of complicated history, the difference in tourism visitors is an order of magnitude smaller than a place like Kenya or Tanzania. And I can certainly answer questions or talk about that later if you'd like. But the point here is in the places that have the highest population growth and have high population density, where conservation has become a global imperative for endangered species, we have to think about sort of what is happening outside and what is happening with people who are living near protected areas and national parks. And just to give you an idea too of land area and how big in the different parks across East Africa, it's really not all that much. But in Uganda, the country on the lower right here, I want you to key in on, because we're going to talk more about that during this talk. So some of you may have heard recently in the last year and a half about one of the places that I work, Queen Elizabeth National Park. So Queen Elizabeth National Park unfortunately made the world news in a couple of years ago because there was an American tourist that was kidnapped along the Congo border. But really this exemplified a larger issue of what we're seeing in this sort of potential for conflict. There's a great article that was done on the Albertine Rift in 2011. And in this National Geographic article, and the picture is shown here, what you see on the right is Queen Elizabeth National Park. Now, Queen Elizabeth National Park is in the floor of the Albertine Rift. It's largely savanna and wooded savanna in this place. And on the left, you see farms. Largely those, there's some cotton farms, but most of this is maize. With a few other crops. What you're seeing here is largely maize. And people farm right up to the edge. And here's a quote from the article that I thought was great, is really that the creation of the national park has made us so poor. And what people say is we have to live on the land because they're so intimately tied to the land. Remember that one of the earlier stats that I showed is about 80% of the people in Uganda are farmers. Most people are rural. And they see these places that are locked up. They're not for them, that they're either owned by the government or or reserved for rich foreigners. They feel like they don't have a place for them, and that they have been taken away from. Now, this is true because as national parks were established, people were kicked out. They were extirpated from these places, and that provides a complicated history. Here I show a picture of a family that was kicked out. That when I met them, that they were living right next to the park boundary and were frustrated. And the gentleman in the front, who is the family elder, showed me his papers that said that he was guaranteed some sort of compensation for when he was living inside the park, and now he has to live outside. It's complicated. Complications because of land tenure. It's complications because of potential claims, land claims when people were living in the national park. This is a complicated environment because of the economic engine that national parks are in East Africa, and in particular in Uganda. Well, what national parks and reserves have become in the Albertine Rift is what you'll see here. This is just a screen grab from Google, okay? And what you can see here is, and where the arrows are pointing, are the different reserves, or different national parks. So there's 10 national parks in Uganda, and you can see a couple of them here. The forests easily stick out. And the reason that they stick out is because population density outside continues to grow, but those are farms outside where forests have been converted and replaced by crops. And so you can see these places that, and evidence that population continues to grow. Well, what does this look like? What I did with some colleagues is take a look more deeply at what's happening in, particularly in Southwest Uganda. And this story plays out in a couple of different ways. So I spent time in some dusty archives with some faculty, with some colleagues, and really tried to figure out what is the change that we've seen in population. Now, this is no easy feat because we had to go back to colonial records and digitize some paper maps and so forth. But what you're seeing here is the population change according to census date. And those dotted lines, and then they become solid, are after the parks have been established, then there was no legal settlement allowed in these places. But what you should see out of this is over time, the continued growth of population, sure, but then you see some very dense populations outside national parks. And I want to talk about one particular park, and that is Kibale National Park. And I'll talk about another one later on. Many of you may know this park because many colleagues from University of Florida and beyond have been working in this place for decades. And it has really become a wonderful place for study, to understand the interaction, the ecological interactions, to understand conservation management and interactions between parks and communities. And Kibale was established in the early 30s as a forest reserve. So it was under the British Crown, and the idea was that, of course, that there would be plantations for pines and cypress that would be used for the colonial government. It wasn't until the 1993 that the national park was established. That was while it was a triumph in some ways, and of course for the international conservation community, because this relatively small park, it's only about 300 square miles, it's about almost 800 square kilometers. And to give you an idea, right, Everglades is enormously bigger than that. So it's a very, very small park. Then I put Yellowstone National Park is about 3,500 square miles, just to give you some comparison. But when it was established in 1993, people were resettled. That's sort of glossing it over. It was not a great day, where people were moved out, where their farms were slashed, burned, and people moved. There was very little compensation, a few sacks of maize and some land given in other places. But really, that was a tough time, to put it lightly. Now, conservation management took over. And this place is known because of its closed canopy forest, because it has its rich biodiversity, has the densest primate biomass in the world. This place was so important for global conservation. And here you can see some of the primate species that are there. But arguably, this is the reason. Largely, it was preserved because of intact chimpanzee habitat. And at the time, Kibale had the largest community of chimpanzees in the world. Not the largest population, but largest community. And so we see that endangered chimpanzees, we also see endangered red colobus monkeys and the vulnerable loist monkey as well, which find their habitat there. But unlike other big parks that you might think about in Africa, I remember when I was starting to think about my work, doing work in Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, I often think of the big savanna landscapes. This landscape is vastly different, and it's reflected in the number of tourists that are there. Relatively small number of tourists come. You know, it's grown since when I started working there. It might have been 3,000 or 4,000 a year, upwards to about 15,000. Certainly, COVID has impacted things, but it's certainly an order of magnitude less than you see in the big savanna parks, like Queen Elizabeth that I showed earlier. And I show this slide here. This is the one slide that I think encapsulates all of my PhD program. It's the one slide that took me over a year and a half to actually make, for all the field work and then all of the image analysis, and we'll probably finish here in about a minute. But the point here with this is that what I want you to see is on the right-hand side is Kibale National Park, or a part of it. And what this shows is the dark green represents intact forests. Again, think about it as important primate habitat. And on the left are where the communities are. And I want you to pick out a couple of things here. Now, I show only a snapshot here in time. But what you should pick out is a couple of things. One, between the two dates, you should see that the park boundaries stay relatively stable. There's not a lot of increase in, or excuse me, there's intact forests, and they're not actually crops inside the park there. What those are, and there's not tea inside the park. Those are probably shrubs or sort of some herbaceous layer. Really, the park over time has actually consolidated its forests. And on the left-hand side, where the communities are, you should pick out a couple of things. See, one, that there's expansion of yellow crops, agricultural land, with new farms being settled, and as population grows, naturally that crops and land under cultivation will grow. But there's also another part to this story. The other part to this story, and what you should pick out, is that there is decline in dark green and that teal color, wetlands. And why this is so important is because those are the resource pools. Those are the unprotected wetlands. Those are the unprotected forests that serve as buffers for the national park. They serve as sometime habitat for primates, but they also serve as important places for people to collect reeds and water and timber for building poles and firewood and for other purposes. Those have declined steadily just over that 1984 to 2013 window. So I want to start here and ask and take a look at whether this is or is not successful conservation. So in 1993, when Kibale National Park was established, right, and people were resettled out of the park, over that period of time, we've seen boundaries have remained relatively stable. We've seen some regrowth and regeneration of forests. There have been some reforestation plans. Those former plantations of cypress and pine that were established because the park was a former forest reserve now have been extracted. So the forests have regenerated. We've seen, in fact, the colobus monkey population is doing fairly well. And we see that, as you can see in that picture, as you see the tea plantations on the right and the forest boundary. There's a relatively hard boundary. Yes, there is no fence, but you can see there's measure distinction between the two places. And when we talk to people, we ask folks, doing a number of surveys over a number of years, has the park helped you in any way? Has it hurt you in any way? And what we found was that most people, about 60% of people, say that the park has helped them in some way. And that only about a third of the people that we talked to said it hurt them in some way. So that is about 2/3 of the people say that Kibale, this national park, has not hurt them. And furthermore, when we asked, should the park stay? Should it be used for forest or for agricultural land? Almost 3/4, 72% of our respondents said that the park should stay. It is important. It is important for a variety of reasons. Now, I can get into that later about why that is. But the point here is that there remains some level of support among the people who live next door to the park. Now, does Kibale represent the larger story that we're seeing inside the Albertine Rift? The answer is yes, in some ways. That forest cover has persisted inside protected areas, while agricultural land has continued to expand. And I'm going to just flip to one more slide here. You can see clearly where the parks are, where those protected areas are, and where the agricultural land is. So in that sense, again, we come back to what has conservation done? It has created these hard boundaries where the national parks are intact. So let's take another pulse check on conservation. Well, using those previous images, we look at the Albertine Rift. Is it successful? Well, the boundaries are relatively stable again. Okay, and we've seen some regeneration of forests, just like we have seen in Kibale National Park. And we have a couple other great success stories in conservation. I'm going to skip down to the last one, and then I'll come back to the gorillas. We have seen successful translocations of Rothschild's giraffes, which had a species population count as low as 650 that were only in Murchison Falls National Park and Kadepo Valley just north. And now Uganda Wildlife Authority has successfully translocated giraffes in a couple of other locations in Uganda. The big success story for this conservation story has been the increase in population of mountain gorillas. So in 2012 only, there were 880 mountain gorillas left in the wild, and they move between places in Uganda, Rwanda, and DRC in the Virunga complex. And because of conservation measures, the total population has steadily increased to where it is now to 1,063. Still not very many at all, but this gradual increase in mountain gorilla population has been a real success story for conservation in this place. When I turn again now to what's happening outside. Population density, again, the story is this is what it looks like outside of national parks. And what you should see there, if you have not been to this landscape before, you should see, imagine that there would have been closed canopy forests here, 100 years ago. And steadily, as people have moved in and cultivated lands and subdivided the lands, there are individual farms here. Farms now have gone from 10, 20, 30 hectares now to individual land holdings somewhere on 1, 2, 3 hectares. And what you should see here also in this picture here are ornamental trees and shade trees and trees grown for eucalyptus trees grown for timber or for firewood, for poles. And and some fruit trees like jackfruit or papayas. But you can also see individual farms if you look closely, individual landowners where there are over 30 different crops that are planted here: maize, millet, sorghum, cassava, sweet potato, what they call Irish potatoes, which are like red skin potatoes, all in this landscape. And if you remember back to that picture or that image that I showed, that difference between Kibale National Park and the communities outside, this is where we are, is that the continued reliance on wetlands and forest fragments have degraded the resource base, which further isolate national parks. And so much of this land has been converted for farming. Here you can see at harvest time that maize was harvested. This was once a bottomland, wetland or wet forest, utilized for firewood, for water, and other resources. So as I said, when we asked people about their support for conservation, the answer was yes, that we do support the park, that it is important, that there are benefits to the park, and that folks say that despite not having access to the park, that they'd rather live close to this park. Let me explain that further. What you're seeing here is the border of the national park. This is Kibale, the national park on the left-hand side, and the maize field on the right. That dark tree, that sort of straightish tree, is a eucalyptus tree that's planted as a boundary tree. And that represents the boundary. That's as clear the boundary that is there. There's no fence. In some places, there's some trenches, but there's no fence. And that allows movement sometimes of people into the forest, and as you can imagine, wildlife from the forest into the fields. And that presents an enormous challenge for people living in these landscapes, where on the left, they see a park that was established because of a global conservation imperative, that there is interest in protecting, particularly primate species here, but there's other species here. And that they are not allowed inside the forest unless there are full or unless there are very resource access agreements, which are, quite frankly, there are not very many of them that are able to be negotiated. Access to the park inside there is extremely limited. And so what results here is that those primates that are protected come from the national park on the left-hand side of the picture over to the right-hand side of the picture. This is public enemy number one, the baboon. And so the baboon that lives in the national park sees those fields as essentially candy stores, and it comes over to raid crops. Now, why is that it's an issue? Well, it's not, as you may have heard or may know, that it's not just the single stalks of corn or maize that are impacted. It's really this continual raiding. Baboons are really, really smart. They learn behavior. They know when people are there, when they're not there, and when people are in the fields working. They know where they're not going to be, and they will continue doing this and continue raiding. And why that's important too, or why it's so detrimental, you can see here that what we've discovered outside Kibale, it's the mean household capital wealth for households is not very much. And what these animals will do is not only destroy crops for the single season, but because we are on the equator, there are two main growing seasons. And so not only are crops destroyed for that season, but they also destroy the seed source for the following season. And so because of that, because food insecurity is so prevalent, what ends up happening is that children are taken out of school and put into the field for guarding. And this happens particularly at harvest time. So we find that 80% of households within 1 kilometer of the park are often in the fields for guarding, at least 2 days a week. But during harvest time, we actually see a higher amount of time spent in the fields. And so what happens is we see something like this. We see children in the fields during the day, all day, missing school. I took this picture back in 2006 when I was doing my dissertation research, and I've come back to it every single year because it exemplifies the challenges that people have living along these places. Is that in that day, about 29% of the students, so what that says is 118 students were absent on that day of 409 enrolled. That's 29% of the people. Most of them probably were in the fields guarding. And how that's manifested is that many of these students we've found have lower test scores in rural areas, and particularly those around national parks, is because many of them are missing school consistently. There's more to this story about about how conservation plays out and the importance of it. Here on the right-hand side in this image is a gorilla habitat at Windy Impenetrable National Park in Southwest Uganda, where the mountain gorillas live. Here in the Albertine Rift, we have 6.5 million people, and again, most of them are farmers, most of them, and also some livestock keepers. Here in this place, the population density is extremely high, as you can see here. Farmers cultivate very small plots of land on very steep slopes. In fact, when I went here, I was told about this place, and I was absolutely astounded when I saw it, that there are very few forests that remain. What you're seeing that looks like forests, those are both pine plantations and also eucalyptus woodlots that are used for fuel wood, for building poles, and so forth. Now, given the enormous population, the dense population, the growing population, and that most of the people subsist on rain-fed farming systems, climate variability is another layer to think about on top of this when we consider how conservation plays out in this place. Now, this is not a talk about the trends in global climate change. We recognize that there is change, and we recognize that how these changes play out in different places is going to be different. But of course, what I want you to see here is what's happening, even just for the 20-year span between 1990 and 2019. Look at the temperature trends in and on the African continent. Let's see how that plays out and why this is important in the Albertine Rift. The Albertine Rift is quite complicated. It's quite complicated because there are a number of different moisture sources from Lake Victoria, Lake Albert, Lake Edward, and from the Congo Basin to the west, and of course the Indian and Atlantic Ocean. It's also complex because it's complex because of the topography, particularly in southwest Uganda, where you see those places called Kasese, Mwea, and Baraza down in the southwest, the lower left of that image there. And so over the last about 10 years, we've begun to work with different authorities in Uganda to start to understand what is happening meteorologically, specifically with rainfall and how that has changing, largely because we want to understand and how rains are changing, and to ultimately help farmers with better forecasting tools. This is what farmers say. After asking hundreds of farmers in the different places that we have worked in, the top bar represents Murchison Falls, the very sort of north of the country down to Kibale, then further south towards the Ruwenzori National Parks, and then Queen Elizabeth. What you should see out of this is that during the so-called dry season, short dry season, December, January, February, that people are saying it's getting drier. Then in the what they call the short rains, the March, April, May rains, it's becoming, most people say, yeah, it's becoming wetter, or it's also different every year. And then during the longer dry season, the June, July, August, almost unanimously people say that it's getting drier, and then so on, it's getting wetter in the September, October, the so-called long rains, getting wetter. Now that has important implications, but we first want to do a check to see that are these perceptions matching with what we're seeing with meteorological data. And in fact, it is true that the two rainy seasons have gotten longer and wetter, with significant increases in duration and total rainfall for the March, April rains over 30 years and or longer. And Southwest Uganda, of all the places, the region number 5, Southwest Uganda has had the largest increase in rainfall. Now, I want to talk to you about why that matters. I'm just going to provide one little sort of anecdote, but this is important as part of the story that continues here with understanding not only rainfall, the continued pressure on places outside national parks and conservation. I happened along this story and now becomes one of my research threads is the increased use of chemicals down in Southwest Uganda. We're seeing this in other places around sub-Saharan Africa. But because the rains have become more, we're finding that people they're not sure when to harvest their crops. They're not sure when to pull them out of the ground. If they leave them in the ground, they're finding that they end up rotting. And so these prolonged wet seasons have caused potato and bean harvest failures because of fungal outbreaks and other diseases. And so because of that, more and more people have started to invest in chemicals, pesticides, fungicides, and other chemical fertilizers. In the past, it was not very widespread. In fact, Uganda, in all of sub-Saharan Africa, was one of the places that had the least amount of use of chemical fertilizers and chemicals for pests and diseases. But now, particularly in Southwest, it's become quite common. More people are spending their income on that. And you see here, and I'll zoom out in a second here to show you what these stores look like. But broadcast spraying is very common. We see that the compounds, which are nice and clean, are cleared by these chemicals. And we're seeing continued health impacts. We're seeing them in nursing mothers. We're seeing them in children. Men are talking to us about rashes and other issues. But here's the reality, is that this use of these chemicals begins to expose wealth inequities. It further widens disparities because people who are the wealthiest can afford these fertilizers, or they can afford different fertilizers. And food shortages or food insecurity is a big issue here. And it is figuring out the means to purchase chemicals. Now, how does that all relate back to conservation? Here's one story that's playing out in the Bwindi landscape. Is that people are telling us, because there is more widespread chemical use, that there are fewer pollinators. So honey production is low, which means that alternative livelihood opportunities increase, and therefore people have begun to move in, or begun to go into the national park to either poach a meat or wildlife, or for other resources. People often have used beehives as natural defenses against crop raiders, but now because honey production has been so low, they find fewer pollinators. Hives are empty, and so fewer hives are being used. So when we come back to how we think about conservation, this is a complicated story. And I'm sure all of you know that in the work that you do in other places. There isn't a simple answer. But I think that we really need to think about what Uganda is and is becoming with respect to the population growth, and how we think about a conservation management plan and this global conservation imperative when thinking about population growth and the knock-on impacts of climate change and other issues. One thing that, Abe and I talked a lot about was this population growth and acceleration near boundaries, and whether it promotes poverty. That's something that I think still needs investigation. There was work in the early late 90s, early 2000s, and then it ramped up into the early 2005, 10, and that story still continues as to how to understand these places that continue to have population growth around them, and what happens outside. Because as population grows, and the areas outside the park, like the wetlands and the forests that continue to be converted, there's certainly potential for human conflict and closer interaction from humans into wildlife, as well as potential disease transmission. We're also seeing dramatic development inside Uganda, specifically about the conundrum between conservation goals and growing pressure for development. So here's a picture in the distance of an oil rig. Oil has been fairly recently discovered under Lake Albert and Edward in what's known as the Albertine Graben, and also underneath Murchison Falls National Park, where the Rothschild's giraffes are. There's also other species there, including chimpanzees and others. It's a complicated story. Production continues to be pushed out, but the estimate of 2.5 billion barrels within the Albertine Graben, if there was production at full capacity, Uganda would be the 5th largest producer of oil in sub-Saharan Africa, which is projected to be 10 to 15% of GDP. Now remember that tourism was only just shy of 8%. So this gives you an idea of how important oil is and will become. So I want to finish up here with something that I tried to sneak this in, and I thought I wanted to share with you something that I think is some of the most fascinating and interesting work of recent. It was done by PhD candidate Nick Dohaniak. And the reason I think this is so fascinating is because as we start to think about these disparities that are widening, and certainly think about the disparities related to conservation and wealth and what's happening with climate change, I think it's really important to think about healthcare. It's important to think about what COVID has done. And the reason I also got thinking about this is simply because my field assistant, who I've worked with for years and years, texts me on a weekly basis and says he's scared. He's scared about how to manage and deal with COVID. And this paper came out in it was so timely. I thought I'd sneak it in here and show you all the tremendous work that's going on here. Is that what you can see here is that the care level of different healthcare facilities increases as you go down. Basically, what you should read at the bottom level are the hospitals. And going from left to right, those are the places within an hour's walk, the densest red, using either your walking, bicycle, or traveling by car. And what you should see in the age of the COVID is that places that where you could treat COVID or handle other important sicknesses, suddenly you reduce the opportunities for healthcare. And you should also read that the places that don't have the access to healthcare are those places in the southwest corner of the country that we just talked about. not the inside the Albertine Rift, in the place with the highest population growth, and we talked about the climate change. So with that, I think as we think about conservation going forward, of course, people have to be part of the not only the situation, they have to be part of the solution. Stop thinking about them just being there, but really incorporating them and thinking about solutions. And it is part of a systems thinking approach, rather than thinking about species management solely as species management. So with that, over the years, there's been so many different funders and organizations. I want to thank certainly my colleague, Pete Newton, who's contributed to this. Folks, particularly my project manager in Uganda, Shamila Namusisi, my longtime field assistant, Jimmy Adiri, and colleague over at the University of New Hampshire. Certainly, folks over in Uganda, including village council leaders and so forth, who have been tremendously helpful. I wouldn't be where I am today without colleagues at UF who were there and have been there. Jane Southworth, Mike Binford, Pete Whalen, Sadie Ryan, Brian Child, Colin Chapman, and of course the Center for African Studies. And lastly, lots of thanks to this gentleman here, Dr. Abe Goldman. It has been my enormous pleasure and to have worked with him, under him, learned from him, and a person that I respect enormously. So I'm just eternally grateful for what I have learned from Dr. Abe Goldman about life, about work, and about life and work balance. So thanks to him, and happy retirement. And with that, thanks to you all, Mabolo Muno, for your attention, and I'm happy to entertain questions.
Thanks, Joel. Okay, folks, if you'll just use the raise hand function there, I will unmute people in the order that questions come up. So we've got about plus or minus 40 minutes to take questions and discussion. So feel free. Okay, Elizabeth, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really great. It's something that I'm really not familiar with. I just had a clarification question. So at one point we were talking about bees and the fact that there are fewer pollinators, and I was just a little confused. So were those bees being used in some capacity before? Like, I don't really understand how they fit into what we were talking about. If you could just—
Yeah, it's a good question. It's something that we've just begun to explore, is that bees in the past were important for, because honey was an alternative livelihood in the southwest Uganda, in communities neighboring Bwindi and Impenetrable National Park. They were important for that, but because of the increased chemical use, that we have found that the bees have gone, that they're no longer seeing the bees there, and that means that folks aren't creating or aren't using beehives anymore. And so that's a lost source of income. And so because of that, and that connection to chemical use, or at least anecdotally, that now they're having to find alternative livelihood sources to supplement their income. And often what they will say is that, yeah, we're going inside the national park because that small cottage industry doesn't support us anymore, and that we've got to find a way to offset that loss. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Riley, go ahead.
Hi, Joel. I also work in Uganda National Park, so it was really nice hearing your talk. I'm wondering, for Kibale National Park, I know there were a lot of community-based conservation pilot programs in the 2000s that kind of prioritized limited access to park resources, beekeeping included, within park boundaries. Have you found at Kibale that like, are there beekeeping programs inside the forest? Are they more successful in like maintaining bees than outside of the forest due to like potentially limited runoff from pesticides? I guess that's my first question.
That's a really good question. So I am not. It's my brother-in-law who's the expert now, who's in beekeeping. You know, this is something that I stumbled upon when I was first there in the early 2000s, and even speaking to Lisa Naughton before me, who was one of the sort of first. Well, she did her PhD over at UF, but she was also one of the first to do some extensive social science research in communities outside. We spoke a bit about this. There were some alternative livelihood approaches, many of them from fishing and to resource gathering and beekeeping. It was small. Since I have been there and since I left, there have been in 2010 and more other initiatives have started to utilize that, and it's not large scale, it's not wide scale, but it has been one way of doing it, and there are a number of small NGOs that have utilized that, and some of them use them for small income opportunities, some of them use them to offset school fees, but I don't know the extent, to be honest with you, of how successful they have been able to do outside of a really sort of small catchment and local influence.
Thanks.
Sure.
Okay, I have a question from Jenna Breland.
Hi, I think I might have missed some details on this. I was just curious about the disappearing wetlands. Is it part of the growing population irrigating crops? Is that part of the problem for the disappearance?
So that's a really good question. There's a couple of reasons for that. The simple answer is because they represent unclaimed land. There's a story behind it about land tenure, and wetlands don't have the same rules that you would see with forest fragments. And so because of that, wetlands are often owned in a customary setting. And so people will locally own those, even though they're not allowed to own them by national law. People often do. And because they have land either adjacent to them or claim them locally, then they will convert them. They will convert them to crops, and they will convert them to small pasture land. The problem with converting them into cropland is that because of the rich peat there, the soils will oxidize fairly quickly, and I mean over a couple of seasons, and they will reduce in productivity fairly quickly. But they're rich soils, at least initially, and that's why they're converted.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, next question from Brian Child. Brian,
hey, Joel.
Hey, buddy.
It was very good to see you, man.
I can't see you, but very, very good to see you.
No, we miss you here at UF. Yeah, I thought your presentation was really excellent and fun and to the point. And I wish conservationists could be realistic like that. So what I do is I look at the ag, and I'm wondering why are those people farming there? I mean, the soils look pretty rich from your photographs, and I know that the Uganda has really good soils, but in many places these farmers are not viable, and they're just being basically marginal people that are being dumped in as far away from the capital city as they can be, which is where the national parks are, because they're also on useless land. So therefore we're getting the poorest people, the most desperate people living next to the national parks. And the problem is not an ecological problem, and it's not an economic problem. It then becomes kind of a political problem of marginalization. I don't know if that's the case. I'd be interested in the farming in a productive country like Uganda, how you see that playing out there. Are these individual farms? Are they viable, or are they being subsidized by jobs in Kampala? What's your sense?
Brian, that is, that is such a good question. It's something I've thought long about. So if you go back to colonial reports, back to the 1910s, 20s, there is this sort of apocalyptic forecast that says that there is no way that, especially in Southwest Uganda and near Wendy, that these parks, or excuse me, the farms will continue, that people will have to move. And we're also seeing too, the part of this story too, Brian, is that as I showed you, there does not look like there's a lot of fuel wood left, but yet when we do thousands of surveys around, people say, yeah, there's enough fuel wood. I'm not sure how, in fact, everybody is able to do it all the time. But this uptick, I mean, 10 years ago, I did not see the widespread use of chemicals. It is all over. It is all over. The simple answer is I don't know, and we are to the point where we're working with some soil scientists to learn more about this. There's some theories about it, that the burning gives the quick flush to nutrients, but I don't even know that's short-lived and whether that works. I would love to talk to a soil scientist too to really understand how soils can persist. And you also saw what's interesting, Brian, too, is that there's increased rainfall, right? And continual cultivation. And so we hear too that many folks complain about loss of topsoil. It just continuously runs downhill. There's not much left. In the Southwest, they've kind of created sloping terraces. I just don't know. And I'd invite somebody else who might know too to talk about this too. That's a really good question, and one I'm trying to get to the bottom of. I wish I had a better answer for you, Brian.
There's no answer.
Okay, next question, Abe Goldman. Go ahead, Abe.
Hey.
Hi, Abe.
Hey, Joel. Wow, great to see you.
Well, I can't see you, but great to see you.
Yes. I should mention, for the sake of other folks here, that Joel has been doing just a huge amount of work, not only here in the area that he's talking about, but all throughout Eastern Africa, along with colleagues and students, and just a spectacular range, both geographically and topically. And it's been great to watch from afar the many, many things you've been involved in. And by the way, I was really interested and impressed, in addition to many other things, what you were saying about the local perceptions of climate change and how it disaggregated by season. But let me ask you, I've got one very general question and one very specific question. So the general question, you've been working, or you and your students and others have been working in this area around Kibale for 15 years, more or less. And I just wonder if there's a couple of 2 or 3 or 4 specific things that really strike you about the changes you've seen on the ground, in addition to the statistical and other changes that you've mentioned over that time period. And that's, of course, mainly in the area around, outside the park. And the really specific question, you were talking about agrochemicals and its increased use, which is also very interesting, because when we were first there was no agrochemical use by small-scale farmers. But there's a real difference between pesticides and fertilizers. And I'm wondering, you were referring mainly to pesticide use of various kinds. I'm wondering if people have started using fertilizers, because of all the East African countries, Uganda has had the lowest use of nitrogen and other fertilizers. And it may now be beginning because of that increased, fragmentation of intensive agriculture.
Yeah, good questions, Dave. I'll answer the pesticide agrochemical question first. Question is, the easy answer is I don't know yet. So we have a couple of grant proposals out to work with NIH, NSF, and a couple of foundations to learn more about this. It's a mixture. So yes, I mean, I lumped them all together because initial work has people sort of buy what they can. And there's not a lot of local knowledge because it's relatively new. And so what is available is sort of lumped in as sort of chemicals and pesticides. And some of them, they hear from word of mouth, they hear from the dealer and what the dealer actually has. And then folks will often use a mixture of those. And so it's hard to tease this out. The other reason for this is because most of the labels are written in English. And you have a translator essentially at the local Duca, the shop, who will sort of write down as you would like write down a prescription when you go into the pharmacist to get pills. Take two of these three times a day and so forth. That's the same thing there. So it's right now what we're seeing in very southwest Bwindi and Gahinga area. There's not a high level of training or education. So people get what they can afford. They get what, if it's closer to the main road, they will have access to a different selection. And which I'm sure you're not surprised that if they have tea, then they have fertilizers. Generally, if they have a commercial crop, then they will be using fertilizers. If not, then they cannot afford that. And so, i.e. tea mostly, that they will just use fungicides and pesticides. Now, again, it's a mixture. Sometimes it's diluted. Sometimes it's not the right stuff. Or they use, one fungicide for everything and broadcast that, let alone the safety precautions in PPE. But that's another story. My impressions, there has been a couple of things that I've seen. One is the dramatic increase in, I would say, small nonprofits that have grown up around Kibale. When we were first there were not many of those. There, and I think that's a good thing. Two, what has really changed the places where I work is power coming in, cell phones coming in. When you and I were there, they were barely just getting over faxes, Abe. And now, of course, cell phones, but roads are paved, and that is going to change the way things are. You and I have a phone call set up, and I will tell you there's lots of local changes that are happening related to the power being brought in. I think that's a really good thing. But those are dramatic changes that are going to change the way things are done. The other thing I've seen too over time is the dramatic increase in just because there are more people there, you can't see the mountains anymore. There's just so much burning going on, so much burning. And we're seeing more and more complaints of asthma and respiratory irritations and so forth. So those are the kinds of the general things that I've seen. There's still the things of that seasons are changing. There's not enough rain. It's not coming at the right time. Those are some of the sort of the things that we've always talked about. But yeah, does that help, Abe?
Yeah. It strikes me. I don't recall ever thinking about air pollution outside, other than inside cooking huts, but generalized air pollution as being, even something you thought about out there, because it was, it was largely clean air. But as you're pointing out, that seems to be a significant change going on.
Oh, absolutely. The oil production is a big thing, Abe, and it should it should really, for conservation, it should really scare folks, and for it's for development economists too. How that's coming in, I think that should be a worry, or at least a bookmark for some concern on oil coming into and how that's being produced and where that wealth is going to go, where the jobs are going to be. I think that is going to have a dramatic impact on the country once they start production.
Okay, we have a question from Juliana.
Hi, I'm Juliana and I'm from the anthropology department. And I really appreciate the fact that you mention a lot about local knowledge and really talking to the local communities about what they think of the park and all of that. And I was wondering, how involved are those local communities in the scientific process itself? So from developing research questions to collecting data and doing the interpretation of data, or if that would be even possible in the area that you work.
Well, I would hope so. I think it's got, it really, of course, depends on the type of work that's being done, whether it's basic research or applied work. I would hope, and I continue to promote that it should be done. In fact, you know, doing my dissertation research, I'm embarrassed to say that I did not do as much reach out because I was young and thought I knew more. Now, that's the way I do it. And then the work that I'm doing now with thinking about pesticides and soil work and thinking about burning and so forth really has come from my field assistants, from local collaborators that are lay people, and from the scientific community, folks that are not scientists to folks that are scientists. That I think is extremely important. One, to create buy-in. Two, to really validate the kinds of questions that you're asking. And three, I think if you depending on the kind of work that you are doing, I'm more interested right now in very applied work and trying to have the work really make it locally relevant. And that is where you need local buy-in. And so for me, that's of the utmost importance. I don't know that everybody is like me. I hope that that folks really do work with local people. But as I'm sure you've seen in your practice, right? It depends.
Thank you.
Sure.
Riley, did you have another question?
Oh, yep, I do. I actually have like a group of questions, if that's okay. So I have a few questions about the tea farming in the Cavalli area. So I'm wondering, in terms of these pesticides that you're kind of seeing an increase in over the past few years, are there like agricultural extension services or tea companies who have similar like extension workers working for them? And if there are these kinds of organizations, do these services target pesticide use for products or certifications? Because I know with coffee, that often has a really big part in how kind of like the culture of pesticide or fertilizer use comes to play.
Sure. So that's a really good question. The answer is not really. So there are extension agents through the National Agricultural Advisory, I forget the services, NADS, and other other groups through the Ministry of Agriculture. Quite honestly, many of these communities are so far flung, they're remote, they're far from the capital or regional, or district capital. So no, there's not a lot of extension. What folks are relying on for application are these local, essentially local merchants. So it would be like you going into the hardware store and that person at the counter telling you how to apply, such and such. Like, just like going into Home Depot, they tell you, how to do with the paint. It's a similar situation with how to manage your chemical use. That, again, that is often in conflict with people's wealth situation. So they have little money, few resources, and want to spread those resources as broadly as they can. So they may be able to afford one chemical, and then they are able to sort of dilute it or spread it among other products or other fields. With respect to fertilizers, so often people, because tea estates use outgrowers, and in order to be a certified outgrower, you have to use you have access to and have to use certain fertilizers. part of your wages that you earn or part of your profits that you earn, you pay back because you have access to fertilizers. What people will do is they will short themselves on the tea for fertilizers or use the extra, quote unquote, and then use that for their other crops. But there is no sort of certification system, and there's no real guidance for using pesticides other than on the tea itself. So you also, as an outgrower, have access to buy often additional, depending on the company, additional fertilizer from the company should you want to. But there's one or two choices. So the answer is not really. There's not guidance.
Okay. And I guess I'm also wondering, I remember reading an article, I don't know if it was by Chapman or someone in his research group, but maybe 10 years ago, on the genetic islanding that was happening because of tea farms with primate populations. Is that becoming an increasing issue? Because looking at the maps that you showed, it seems like a lot of the tea farms surrounding the park are obviously increasing over the past few decades.
Yeah, so I'm not a geneticist, and I'm not going to attempt to play one. However, yeah, so yes, they're either islandizing or they're just being eliminated. Park or forest fragments and wetlands tend to exist inside large tea estates, and that's largely because there is some level of environmental protection ordinance or rules or in compliance that tea estates have to have. Not so much, but absent of that, unless they're big enough to be mapped and certified locally or by the National Forestry Authority, that those fragments will be eaten up, will be fully converted, mostly into farms. And so the minimal fragments that have left, I mean, we've seen these over the decade and a half, is that fragments that were once there not only have become increasingly smaller or gone, but we're also seeing the loss of juvenile trees. And so you have this understory and some big trees left. And the importance of that is a couple reasons. One is because the juvenile trees will, of course, grow into later succession trees. But two, those are often used for building poles, and because they're hardwoods, they're used for building poles because they're generally harder and resist termites more, and they produce what they call a white and a blue flame. So think about it when you're having a bonfire, right? You want the wood that burns longer and hotter. Same thing when you're using cook stoves. And so they will take the juvenile trees, which are easier to carry, easier for kids and young boys to harvest, and that doesn't allow a multi-succession stage forest to grow up. And so often is that primate species end up not lasting in these places, or you have generalists like the black and white colobus monkey and the vervet monkey that can forage back and forth between the agricultural landscape. And that's ends up what you're seeing. But you're not going to see often chimps or other sometimes you see some mangabees, but generally that's what's going to happen with the fragments.
Okay, anybody else with a question or comments? We've got about 10 minutes. I think you wore them out, Joel.
Well, that's great. I'm thrilled. I love doing this. This is so much fun for me. I wish I was in that really hot room and Grinter and doing this. I wish I could see you all. And I'm enormously grateful that Brian and Abe were here. Yeah, it's been great to hear from you. And thanks. I'm glad to hear that the NRM group continues to this day. One of the former leaders of that, Karen Bailey, who's now at CU2, just speaks highly of what in the sponsorship of the Center for African Studies. So thanks to you, Todd, and for the center for all the support.
Great. It's good to see you, Joel. Stay
Likewise.
well.
All right.
Enjoy your weekend.
Yep. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks again.
Bye now.
Bye now.